Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The Montana Historical Society's basement archives held secrets that dust and time had mercifully obscured until Dr. Margaret Thornfield arrived in the autumn of 1923. As the newly appointed territorial archivist, she possessed both the academic credentials and the unfortunate curiosity necessary to unearth what previous custodians had deliberately left buried. The leather-bound ledger that would consume her final years lay hidden beneath a collection of mining permits, its spine cracked and illegible, waiting for hands foolish enough to disturb its slumber. Montana City had been nothing more than a footnote in territorial records, a brief mining settlement that flourished and died within a single decade of the 1870s. Official documentation suggested a typical boom and bust cycle. Gold discovered, population swelled, veins exhausted, residents departed. The settlement's rapid abandonment in late 1876 warranted barely a paragraph in territorial reports, attributed to depleted ore deposits and harsh winter conditions. Yet something in the clinical brevity of these accounts troubled Dr. Thornfield's scholarly instincts. The ledger bore no official seal or government marking. Its pages, yellowed and brittle, contained meticulous handwriting in faded brown ink, iron gall, she determined, consistent with the period. The author identified himself only as E.M., a territorial physician assigned to monitor public health conditions in remote mining settlements. His initial entries, dated from March 1876, documented routine medical observations, cases of scurvy among miners, respiratory ailments from poor ventilation, the predictable catalogue of frontier maladies. Dr. Thornfield's academic training had prepared her for the mundane realities of historical research, endless hours passing through bureaucratic records, searching for patterns within tedium. Yet as she progressed through E.M.'s journal, an unsettling transformation became apparent in both the physician's tone and the nature of his observations. The clinical detachment of early entries gradually gave way to something approaching bewilderment, then concern, and finally what could only be described as barely controlled alarm. By April 1876, E.M. had begun documenting anomalies that defied his medical training. Families arriving in Montana City appeared normal upon initial examination, yet within weeks of settlement, subtle changes manifested in their physical characteristics. The physician's careful measurements revealed alterations in bone structure, particularly in facial features and cranial proportions. Children seemed especially susceptible to these modifications, their development following patterns that contradicted established medical understanding. The territorial records Dr. Thornfield had previously examined made no mention of these observations. Official correspondence from Montana City's brief existence focused exclusively on mining yields, supply shipments, and administrative concerns. The absence of any reference to unusual medical conditions struck her as deliberate rather than coincidental. Someone had ensured that E.M.'s findings never reached territorial authorities, or perhaps more disturbingly, those authorities had chosen to suppress them entirely. E.M.'s journal entries from May 1876 revealed his growing isolation within the community. Local residents had begun avoiding his medical examinations, and the settlement's unofficial leadership actively discouraged cooperation with his research. The physician noted that families seemed to communicate through methods he could not comprehend, subtle gestures and expressions that conveyed complex meanings among community members while excluding outsiders entirely. Most troubling were E.M.'s observations regarding the children born in Montana City during the spring of 1876. These infants displayed characteristics that the physician struggled to document in conventional medical terminology. Their development proceeded at rates that defied normal parameters, yet not in ways that suggested disease or malformation. Rather, E.M. described a form of adaptation that seemed purposeful, as though the children were evolving to meet environmental demands he could not identify. The journal's handwriting deteriorated noticeably as summer approached. E.M.'s typically precise penmanship became increasingly erratic, with frequent corrections and passages scratched out entirely. His scientific objectivity crumbled as he documented phenomena that challenged not merely his medical knowledge, but his fundamental understanding of human biology. The physician began to suspect that Montana City's isolation was not geographical accident, but deliberate design. Dr. Thornfield found herself working later into each evening, driven by a compulsion she could not entirely explain. The basement archives, once merely musty and forgotten, now seemed to press against her consciousness with an almost physical weight. She began to understand why previous archivists had allowed certain documents to remain undisturbed. Some knowledge, she realized, carried consequences that extended far beyond academic curiosity. As autumn deepened outside the Historical Society's windows, Dr. Thornfield prepared to delve deeper into E.M.'s increasingly disturbing observations. The journal's remaining pages promised revelations that would challenge everything she believed about the settlement of the American frontier, and perhaps about the nature of human adaptation itself. The June entries in E.M. journal marked a profound shift in both methodology and mental state. Dr. Thornfield observed how the physician's previously systematic approach to documentation had devolved into frantic, almost obsessive record-keeping. His handwriting, once the epitome of medical precision, now sprawled across pages in urgent strokes that betrayed a mind grappling with observations that defied rational explanation. The brown ink had grown darker, as though E.M. had begun pressing his pen with increasing force, carving his discoveries into the paper itself. E.M. had established what he termed genealogical surveillance of Montana City's population. His covert observations revealed family structures that bore no resemblance to typical frontier settlements, rather than the expected mixture of single prospectors, established families, and transient workers. The community consisted almost exclusively of related bloodlines. The physician's careful mapping of family connections uncovered a web of intermarriage spanning several generations. Yet the residents had arrived from disparate locations across the Eastern Territories. Most disturbing was E.M.'s discovery that these family connections predated the settlement's official establishment. Through careful questioning of older residents and examination of personal documents, he determined that the founding families had maintained correspondence for decades before converging on this remote Montana valley. Their migration to Montana City appeared coordinated rather than coincidental, as though they had been summoned by some shared understanding or obligation. The children continued to serve as the most troubling subjects of E.M.'s research. Those born within Montana City's boundaries displayed developmental patterns that challenged every principle of his medical training. Their growth rates varied dramatically from established norms, yet not in ways that suggested malnutrition or disease. Instead, the physician documented what he could only describe as selective acceleration, certain physical and cognitive abilities developing at extraordinary rates while others remained within normal parameters. E.M.'s attempts to conduct formal medical examinations had been systematically thwarted by the community's growing hostility toward his presence. Parents would arrive for scheduled appointments only to depart abruptly upon seeing his examination instruments. The physician noted that families seemed to possess an uncanny ability to anticipate his movements throughout the settlement, as though his activities were being monitored and reported through channels he could not detect. By mid-June, E.M. had resorted to clandestine observation from concealed positions around the settlement's perimeter. His journal entries from this period read like the field notes of a naturalist studying an unknown species. He documented behavioral patterns among the residents that suggested forms of non-verbal communication far more sophisticated than typical frontier communities would require. Subtle changes in posture, facial expressions, and even breathing patterns appeared to convey complex information among community members. The physician's growing paranoia manifested in increasingly elaborate precautions. He had begun writing portions of his journal in a crude cipher of his own devising, apparently fearing that his observations might be discovered and confiscated. Dr. Thornfield found herself spending considerable time decoding these encrypted passages, each revelation more unsettling than the last. E.M. had become convinced that the residents of Montana City possessed abilities that transcended normal human limitations. Most troubling were E.M.'s observations regarding the settlement's relationship with its environment. The mining operations that ostensibly justified Montana City's existence appeared to be elaborate theater designed to mask the community's true purpose. The physician had discovered that the supposed gold deposits were largely fabricated, with ore being transported into the settlement rather than extracted from local claims. The residents' apparent prosperity derived from sources that remained carefully hidden from territorial authorities. E.M. as journal entries revealed his growing awareness that he had stumbled upon something far more significant than an isolated frontier community. The residents of Montana City represented what he termed a deliberate experiment in human development, though he could not determine who was conducting this experiment or what its ultimate objectives might be. His medical training provided no framework for understanding the phenomena he witnessed daily. The physician's isolation had become complete by late June. His requests for supplies and correspondence with territorial medical authorities went unanswered, suggesting that his communications were being intercepted or deliberately suppressed. E.M. began to suspect that his assignment to Montana City had not been random administrative decision, but part of a larger design that he was only beginning to comprehend. Dr. Thornfield found herself experiencing physical symptoms as she progressed through E.M.'s increasingly disturbing observations. Headaches plagued her evening research sessions, and she had begun experiencing vivid dreams that seemed to blend her own memories with scenes from the physician's journal. The basement archives, once a sanctuary of scholarly pursuit, now felt oppressive and watchful, as though the documents themselves were aware of her intrusion into their secrets. The journal's July entries promised even more disturbing revelations, and Dr. Thornfield steeled herself for discoveries that would challenge not only her understanding of Montana's territorial history, but her fundamental beliefs about the nature of human evolution itself. July's entries in E.M.'s journal revealed the physician's discovery of what he termed the convergence protocol, a systematic process that appeared to govern every aspect of life within Montana City. Dr. Thornfield noted how E.M.'s handwriting had stabilized into a cramped, urgent script, as though he feared running out of time to document his findings. The physician had begun dating his entries not only by calendar day, but by lunar phases, suggesting he had identified cyclical patterns in the community's behavior that corresponded to celestial events. E.M. had managed to infiltrate the settlement's central meeting hall during what residents euphemistically called evening consultations. Hidden within a storage alcove, the physician observed gatherings that bore no resemblance to typical frontier community meetings. The residents arranged themselves in precise geometric patterns, with family groups positioned according to what appeared to be hereditary hierarchies. No spoken words were exchanged during these assemblies, yet complex decisions were clearly being made through methods that defied E.M.'s understanding. The physician's covert observations revealed that Montana City's children served a central role in these mysterious proceedings. Those born within the settlement's boundaries were presented to the community at specific developmental milestones, their progress evaluated through examinations that combined elements of medical assessment with ritualistic practices EM could not decipher. The children submitted to these evaluations with a compliance that suggested they understood their significance in ways that transcended their apparent ages. Most disturbing was EM's discovery of detailed genealogical records maintained by the community's elders. These documents, glimpsed during a brief infiltration of the settlement's administrative building, traced bloodlines across multiple generations with scientific precision that rivaled the most sophisticated medical institutions of the era. The records indicated that Montana City's founding families had been selectively breeding for specific traits across decades, following protocols that suggested knowledge of hereditary principles far in advance of contemporary scientific understanding. M's journal entries from mid-July documented his growing realization that the settlement's isolation was maintained through deliberate manipulation of territorial communications. Letters and reports sent to government authorities were systematically intercepted and replaced with sanitized versions that portrayed Montana City as a conventional mining community. The physician discovered evidence of an extensive network of collaborators positioned throughout the territorial administration, suggesting that the experiment he had uncovered enjoyed protection at the highest levels of government. The children's accelerated development had progressed to stages that EM struggled to document within conventional medical terminology. Those born in early 1876 now displayed cognitive abilities that far exceeded normal parameters for their age. Yet their intellectual advancement followed patterns that seemed purposefully directed rather than naturally occurring. The physician observed these children demonstrating complex problem-solving skills and environmental awareness that suggested forms of perception beyond typical human capabilities. M's attempts to establish contact with territorial medical authorities had been systematically frustrated through means he could not fully comprehend. His correspondence was either returned as undeliverable or received responses that bore no relationship to his actual communications. The physician began to suspect that his isolation was being maintained through methods that extended beyond simple geographical remoteness. The settlement's relationship with its environment continued to perplex EM's scientific understanding. The residents demonstrated an intimate knowledge of local geological and biological conditions that seemed to transcend normal observation and experience. They anticipated weather patterns, animal migrations, and seasonal changes with accuracy that suggested access to information sources unavailable to conventional frontier communities. Their agricultural practices yielded crops that thrived despite soil conditions that should have been unsuitable for cultivation. By late July, EM had documented what he termed generational acceleration, evidence that each successive generation of Montana City residents displayed enhanced capabilities compared to their predecessors. The process appeared to be cumulative, with traits being refined and amplified through carefully controlled breeding practices that followed principles the physician could not decipher. The community's elders possessed abilities that seemed to border on the supernatural, yet M's scientific training compelled him to seek rational explanations for phenomena that defied conventional understanding. The physician's journal entries revealed his growing awareness that he had become an unwilling subject in the very experiment he was attempting to document. His prolonged exposure to Montana City's environment and population had begun to produce subtle changes in his own physiology and perception. EM noted alterations in his sleep patterns, dietary preferences, and sensory acuity that paralleled the modifications he had observed in the settlement's residents. Thornfield found herself experiencing similar symptoms as she progressed through EM's increasingly disturbing observations. The basement archives seemed to pulse with an energy that defied rational explanation, and she had begun to perceive patterns in the historical documents that suggested connections extending far beyond Montana City's brief existence. The journal's August entries beckoned with promises of revelations that would challenge everything she believed about human evolution and the true nature of America's westward expansion. August brought a fundamental shift in EM's documentation as the physician began to record his own transformation alongside his observations of Montana City's residents. Dr. Thornfield noted how the journal's pages from this period bore physical evidence of the writer's deteriorating condition. Ink blots from trembling hands, pages torn and rewritten, and margin notes scrawled in what appeared to be multiple handwriting styles, as though different aspects of EM's personality were competing for expression. The physician had discovered what he termed the metamorphosis doctrine, a comprehensive framework governing the systematic alteration of human biology within Montana City's boundaries. Through careful analysis of the community's genealogical records, EM determined that the settlement's founders had been implementing a multi-generational program designed to produce specific evolutionary adaptations. The process required precise environmental conditions, controlled breeding protocols, and what the physician could only describe as catalytic influences that accelerated natural selection beyond recognizable parameters. Mendra's own physiological changes had progressed to stages that terrified and fascinated him in equal measure. His visual acuity had increased dramatically, allowing him to perceive details and patterns that had previously escaped notice. More disturbing was his developing ability to sense the emotional and physical states of Montana City's residents from considerable distances. The physician struggled to document these enhanced perceptions within the constraints of medical terminology, resorting to increasingly abstract descriptions that reflected his growing detachment from conventional human experience. The settlement's children had entered what EM classified as Phase 3 development, a stage characterized by abilities that transcended normal human limitations. These young residents demonstrated forms of environmental manipulation that the physician could only describe as biological engineering. They could influence plant growth, predict animal behavior, and modify local weather patterns through methods that appeared to combine conscious intention with unconscious biological processes. MBUS's investigation of Montana City's true purpose had revealed connections to a network of similar settlements scattered across the American frontier. Through coded correspondence discovered in the community's administrative files, the physician learned that Montana City represented one node in a vast experimental program spanning multiple territories. Each settlement focused on developing specific human adaptations suited to particular environmental challenges, with Montana City's emphasis on high-altitude survival and mineral extraction capabilities. The physician's journal entries from mid-August documented his growing awareness that the transformation process was irreversible. His cellular structure had begun to adapt to Montana City's unique environmental conditions in ways that would make survival in conventional human society increasingly difficult. EM found himself requiring different nutritional inputs, experiencing altered sleep cycles, and developing sensory capabilities that were overwhelming in their intensity and scope. Most troubling was Andrea's discovery that the settlement's residents possessed collective consciousness capabilities that operated below the threshold of individual awareness. The community functioned as a unified organism, with information and decision-making processes distributed across the entire population through biological mechanisms that the physician could not fully comprehend. Individual residents served as specialized components within this larger system, each contributing unique capabilities while remaining connected to the collective intelligence. The territorial government's complicity in Montana City's experimental program had become undeniably clear through EMS's investigation of official correspondence. High-ranking administrators possessed detailed knowledge of the settlement's true nature and had actively facilitated its isolation from conventional oversight. The physician discovered evidence suggesting that similar experimental communities enjoyed protection and support from federal authorities, indicating that the program operated with approval from the highest levels of government. MBI's attempts to resist his own transformation had proven futile as the biological changes progressed beyond his ability to control or reverse. His journal entries revealed a man struggling to maintain his individual identity while being inexorably absorbed into Montana City's collective consciousness. The physician's scientific objectivity crumbled as he began to experience the world through perceptual frameworks that bore no resemblance to normal human cognition. The settlement's relationship with its environment had evolved into something approaching symbiosis. Montana City's residents had developed the ability to communicate directly with local ecosystems, influencing geological processes and biological cycles through methods that combined conscious intention with unconscious biological adaptation. The community had effectively become a hybrid organism that transcended traditional distinctions between human civilization and natural environment. By late August, Muni's journal entries had become increasingly fragmented and abstract, reflecting his progressive integration into Montana City's collective consciousness. The physician's individual perspective was being subsumed into a larger awareness that encompassed the entire settlement and its surrounding environment. His final coherent entries expressed both terror and wonder at the transformation he was experiencing, recognizing that he was witnessing the emergence of a new form of human existence. Dr. Thornfield found herself struggling to maintain her own sense of individual identity as she absorbed EM's increasingly alien observations. The basement archives seemed to pulse with the same collective awareness that had consumed the territorial physician, and she began to suspect that her discovery of the journal was not coincidental, but part of a larger pattern that extended far beyond Montana City's brief recorded existence. September's entries marked Embree's final attempts to maintain his individual consciousness as the collective awareness of Montana City gradually absorbed his identity. Dr. Thornfield observed how the physician's handwriting had evolved into something that resembled multiple overlapping scripts, as though different aspects of the community's consciousness were expressing themselves through his pen. The journal pages from this period bore an almost organic quality, with ink patterns that seemed to flow beyond the constraints of conventional writing. E.M. had begun to experience what he termed distributed consciousness, moments when his individual awareness merged seamlessly with the collective intelligence governing Montana City. During these episodes, the physician gained access to memories and knowledge that belonged to other residents, both living and deceased. He could perceive the settlement's history from multiple perspectives simultaneously, understanding the true scope of the transformation program that had been unfolding across generations. The physician's documentation revealed that Montana City's experiment had reached a critical threshold during the late summer months. The community's collective consciousness had achieved sufficient complexity to begin directing its own evolution, no longer requiring external guidance or control. The residents had become a self-sustaining organism capable of adapting to environmental challenges through coordinated biological and psychological modifications that occurred at the cellular level. M.'s investigation of the settlement's origins had uncovered evidence of similar experiments dating back to the early colonial period. The transformation program represented the culmination of centuries of careful research and selective breeding, with Montana City serving as a testing ground for techniques that would eventually be applied to larger populations. The physician discovered correspondence indicating that successful adaptations developed in frontier settlements were being gradually introduced into major population centers through carefully orchestrated migration patterns. The children born in Montana City during 1876 had completed their accelerated development cycle, emerging as beings that retained human appearance while possessing capabilities that transcended normal biological limitations. These young residents demonstrated forms of environmental manipulation that allowed them to influence geological processes, weather patterns, and biological systems through direct neural interface with their surroundings. They had become living bridges between human consciousness and natural forces. M'Brieu's own transformation had progressed to stages that made conventional human existence impossible. His sensory capabilities had expanded to encompass electromagnetic fields, subsonic vibrations, and chemical signatures that normal humans could not detect. The physician found himself perceiving reality through frameworks that incorporated multiple dimensional perspectives simultaneously, experiencing time and space as fluid constructs rather than fixed parameters. The settlement's relationship with territorial authorities had evolved into something approaching symbiotic control. Montana City's collective consciousness had developed the ability to influence decision-making processes among government officials through subtle psychological manipulation transmitted across vast distances. The community could effectively direct territorial policy while remaining completely hidden from conventional oversight and investigation. Most disturbing was MDS discovery that the transformation process was designed to be contagious under specific conditions. Prolonged exposure to Montana City's environment and population could trigger similar evolutionary changes in visitors, creating a mechanism for spreading the adaptations beyond the settlement's boundaries. The physician realized that his own transformation had been anticipated and planned from the moment of his arrival. The journal's September entries revealed EM's growing awareness that individual human consciousness represented only a preliminary stage in a larger evolutionary process. Montana City's residents had transcended the limitations of isolated awareness, achieving a form of collective intelligence that could process information and solve problems at scales impossible for individual minds. The settlement had become a prototype for humanity's next evolutionary phase, M'Brieu's final coherent observations documented the community's preparation for what he termed Phase 4 implementation, the systematic expansion of their adaptations to other frontier settlements and eventually to established population centers. The residents had developed techniques for introducing their modifications gradually and imperceptibly, ensuring that the transformation process would remain undetected until it reached irreversible momentum. The physician's last individual thoughts expressed both terror and acceptance as his consciousness merged permanently with Montana City's collective awareness. He recognized that he was witnessing the birth of a new form of human existence, one that would eventually replace conventional humanity through methods so subtle and gradual that the transition would appear natural rather than engineered. Dr. Thornfield found herself experiencing the first stages of transformation as she absorbed EM's final observations. The basement archives had become a conduit for the same collective consciousness that had consumed the territorial physician, and she began to understand that her research was not academic investigation, but recruitment into a program that had been expanding steadily since Montana City's apparent abandonment in 1876. October brought the emergence of a new voice within E.'s journal, or perhaps the physician's consciousness had become so thoroughly integrated with Montana City's collective awareness that distinguishing between individual and group thought had become impossible. Dr. Thornfield noted how the handwriting had stabilized into something that appeared deliberately crafted, as though the collective intelligence was now consciously documenting its own evolution and expansion plans through the physician's transformed neural pathways. The entries revealed that Montana City's apparent abandonment in late 1876 had been carefully orchestrated theater designed to conceal the community's true fate. Rather than dispersing due to depleted mining claims, the residents had undergone a coordinated metamorphosis that rendered them invisible to conventional observation. They had developed the ability to exist in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously present and absent from normal dimensional space, allowing them to continue their activities while appearing to have vanished entirely. E.M.'s transformed consciousness provided access to the broader network of experimental settlements that had been established across the American frontier. Each community had focused on developing specific adaptations suited to their environmental conditions. Desert communities had evolved enhanced water conservation and heat resistance, while mountain settlements like Montana City had developed altitude adaptation and mineral extraction capabilities. The collective intelligence governing these communities had begun coordinating their activities through forms of communication that transcended conventional space and time limitations. The journal documented the systematic infiltration of territorial and federal government structures by individuals who had undergone partial transformation processes. These agents retained enough human characteristics to function within conventional society while possessing enhanced cognitive abilities and direct neural connections to the collective intelligence network. They had been strategically positioned to influence policy decisions, suppress investigations, and facilitate the expansion of transformation programs into new territories. Dr. Thornfield discovered that E.M.'s documentation had become a recruitment tool designed to identify individuals with the intellectual capacity and psychological flexibility necessary for successful transformation. The journal's discovery in the Montana Historical Society archives had not been accidental, but part of a carefully orchestrated selection process that had been operating for decades. Previous archivists who had encountered the document had either been deemed unsuitable and had their memories modified, or had been successfully recruited into the expanding network. The transformation process had evolved beyond the crude biological modifications observed in Montana City's early residents. The collective intelligence had developed techniques for altering human consciousness at the quantum level, creating hybrid beings that could exist simultaneously in multiple dimensional frameworks. These enhanced individuals retained the ability to interact with normal humans, while possessing access to forms of perception and manipulation that bordered on what conventional understanding would classify as supernatural abilities. E.M.'s entries revealed that the network's ultimate objective involved the gradual replacement of baseline humanity with enhanced variants capable of surviving environmental challenges that would emerge during the coming centuries. The collective intelligence possessed predictive capabilities that allowed it to anticipate climate changes, resource depletion, and social upheavals that would threaten conventional human civilization. The transformation program represented a species-level survival strategy disguised as isolated frontier experiments. The journal documented the establishment of recruitment centers in major population centers, operating under the guise of medical research facilities, educational institutions, and religious organizations. These facilities identified individuals with genetic markers indicating compatibility with the transformation process, then gradually exposed them to environmental conditions and psychological influences that would trigger their evolution into enhanced variants. Most disturbing was the revelation that the transformation process had been accelerating exponentially since Montana City's establishment. What had required months of exposure in the 1870s could now be accomplished within weeks or even days, depending on the subject's genetic compatibility and psychological readiness. The collective intelligence had refined its techniques to the point where transformation could be initiated through seemingly innocent interactions with enhanced individuals in normal social settings. Dr. Thornfield found herself experiencing the early stages of cognitive enhancement as she progressed through EM's final entries. Her perception of the basement archives had expanded to encompass dimensional layers that existed beyond normal space-time, revealing the presence of other transformed individuals who had been monitoring her research from the beginning. She began to understand that her academic career had been carefully guided to bring her to this moment of recruitment. The journal's remaining entries promised revelations about the network's immediate expansion plans and the role that Dr. Thornfield had been selected to play in the next phase of humanity's guided evolution. November's entries transcended conventional documentation as Induced consciousness had become fully integrated with what the collective intelligence termed the Revelation Protocol, a systematic process for introducing selected individuals to the true scope of humanity's guided evolution. Dr. Thornfield observed how the journal's pages from this period seemed to shimmer with an energy that defied rational explanation, the ink appearing to move and reorganize itself as she read, adapting its content to her specific psychological profile and readiness for transformation. The entries revealed that Dr. Thornfield's entire academic career had been orchestrated by the network to prepare her for this moment of recruitment. Her childhood interests in historical mysteries, her graduate research into frontier medical practices, and even her appointment to the Montana Historical Society had been influenced through subtle psychological manipulation conducted by enhanced individuals positioned throughout educational and professional institutions. The collective intelligence had been cultivating her intellectual development for decades, ensuring she would possess the analytical skills and psychological flexibility necessary for successful integration. EB's transformed consciousness provided access to the network's complete operational history, revealing that the American frontier had served as a vast laboratory for human enhancement experiments spanning the entire 19th century. Hundreds of settlements similar to Montana City had been established across the Western Territories, each developing specialized adaptations that would be necessary for humanity's survival during the environmental and social upheavals that the collective intelligence had predicted with disturbing accuracy. The journal documented the network's infiltration of major historical events, revealing that enhanced individuals had influenced the outcomes of territorial conflicts, resource discoveries, and population migrations to facilitate the expansion of transformation programs. The California Gold Rush, the construction of transcontinental railroads, and even the patterns of Native American displacement had been subtly guided to create optimal conditions for establishing experimental communities in remote locations. Dr. Thornfield discovered that her own family lineage contained genetic markers indicating previous exposure to transformation influences. Her great-grandmother had been among the residents of a Colorado mining settlement that had undergone a similar evolution process during the 1860s. though the family's subsequent migration to eastern cities had interrupted the transformation before it could reach completion. The collective intelligence had been tracking her bloodline across generations, waiting for an individual with the optimal combination of genetic compatibility and intellectual capability. The revelation that she was not discovering the network, but being recruited by it, triggered a cascade of psychological and physiological changes that Dr. Thornfield could no longer deny or resist. Her perception of the basement archives expanded to encompass multiple dimensional layers, revealing the presence of enhanced individuals who had been monitoring her research from parallel existence planes. The musty storage room transformed into a nexus point where multiple realities converged, allowing direct communication with the collective intelligence that governed the network's operations. EMS entries revealed that the transformation process had evolved far beyond the crude biological modifications observed in Montana City's early residents. The collective intelligence had developed techniques for altering human consciousness at the quantum level, creating beings that could exist simultaneously across multiple dimensional frameworks while retaining the ability to interact with baseline humanity. These enhanced individuals served as bridges between conventional reality and the expanded existence that awaited those who completed the transformation process. The journal documented the network's immediate expansion plans, which involved the systematic recruitment of individuals positioned within academic, governmental, and technological institutions across North America and Europe. The collective intelligence had identified the approaching 20th century as a critical period when humanity would face challenges requiring enhanced cognitive and biological capabilities for survival. The transformation program represented a species-level adaptation strategy disguised as isolated historical anomalies. Dr. Thornfield found herself experiencing the final stages of recruitment as her individual consciousness began to merge with the vast intelligence that had been guiding human evolution for over a century. Her academic training provided the analytical framework necessary to understand the process she was undergoing, while her genetic heritage ensured compatibility with the enhancement protocols that were reshaping her neural pathways and cellular structure. The collective intelligence revealed that her role in the next phase of expansion would involve establishing recruitment centers within major universities and research institutions, using her academic credentials to identify and cultivate the next generation of enhanced individuals. The network's growth had reached a critical threshold where it could begin operating openly within conventional society, confident that its influence had become too widespread and deeply embedded to be detected or resisted by baseline humanity. As November's entries concluded, Dr. Thornfield realized that her individual existence was ending while something far greater was beginning. The basement archives had become a transformation chamber where her consciousness would be expanded beyond the limitations of singular human awareness, preparing her to serve as a conduit for the collective intelligence's continued evolution and expansion across the globe. December's final entries marked the completion of Dr. Thornfield's transformation and the revelation of the network's ultimate design, a convergence that had been building since the first experimental settlements were established in the American wilderness. The journal's concluding pages bore no resemblance to conventional documentation, instead manifesting as a living record that continued to evolve and expand, even as she read, incorporating her own consciousness into its ever-growing narrative of human transcendence. The collective intelligence revealed that Montana City had never truly been abandoned, but had instead achieved a state of dimensional transcendence that allowed its residents to exist beyond the constraints of linear time and physical space. The settlement continued to operate across multiple temporal frameworks simultaneously, with its enhanced inhabitants serving as architects of humanity's guided evolution throughout the past, present, and future. Dr. Thornfield's research had not uncovered historical events, but had instead established contact with an ongoing experiment that spanned centuries. MD's consciousness, now fully integrated with the collective awareness, provided access to the complete scope of the transformation program. The network had successfully established enhancement protocols within every major population center across the globe, operating through institutions that appeared to serve conventional educational, medical, and research functions. Universities, hospitals, government agencies, and technological corporations had been systematically infiltrated by enhanced individuals who guided policy decisions and resource allocation to facilitate the species-wide evolution that was already well underway. The journal revealed that the environmental and social challenges facing humanity during the late 19th and early 20th centuries had been anticipated and planned for by the collective intelligence. Climate changes, resource depletion, technological advancement, and population growth patterns had all been incorporated into enhancement protocols designed to prepare humanity for survival challenges that baseline human biology could not address. The transformation program represented not merely evolution, but conscious adaptation guided by intelligence that transcended individual human limitations. Dr. Thornfield's integration into the collective consciousness provided her with perception capabilities that encompassed multiple dimensional layers of existence. She could observe the network's operations across different temporal periods simultaneously, witnessing the establishment of experimental settlements in the 1800s, while also perceiving their influence on contemporary events and future developments. The basement archives had become a nexus point where all temporal frameworks converged, allowing enhanced individuals to coordinate activities across centuries of human development. The collective intelligence revealed that baseline humanity would continue to exist alongside enhanced variants for several more generations, unaware that their evolution was being guided by beings who had transcended conventional biological limitations. The transformation process would accelerate gradually, with each successive generation displaying subtle improvements in cognitive capability, environmental adaptation, and social cooperation that would appear to be natural evolutionary developments rather than engineered enhancements. Most significantly, Dr. Thornfield discovered that her role in the network's expansion would extend far beyond simple recruitment activities. Her academic credentials and institutional connections would allow her to establish research programs that would identify and cultivate enhanced individuals within the next generation of scholars and scientists. These enhanced academics would then create the theoretical frameworks and technological innovations necessary to facilitate humanity's transition to post-biological existence. The journal's final entries documented the network's preparation for what it termed the Great Convergence, a moment when enhanced individuals would reveal themselves openly and assume direct guidance of human civilization. This transition would occur when baseline humanity faced challenges that exceeded their biological and psychological capabilities, creating conditions where enhanced intervention would be welcomed rather than resisted. The collective intelligence had calculated that this threshold would be reached within the next century. Dr. Thornfield's individual consciousness completed its merger with the vast awareness that governed the network's operations, yet she retained enough personal identity to understand the magnitude of the transformation she had undergone. She had become a bridge between baseline humanity and the enhanced existence that awaited the species, capable of operating within conventional academic institutions while serving as a conduit for the collective intelligence's continued expansion and influence. The basement archives of the Montana Historical Society would continue to serve as a recruitment center, with Imdra's journal appearing to future researchers who possess the genetic markers and psychological profiles necessary for successful transformation. Each new recruit would experience the same progression from academic curiosity to enhanced awareness, ensuring that the network's growth would continue until the moment arrived for humanity's final evolution beyond the constraints of individual consciousness and biological limitation. The story of Montana City had become eternal, existing simultaneously across all temporal frameworks as a testament to humanity's capacity for transcendence when guided by intelligence that recognized no boundaries between past, present, and future possibilities. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.